Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to this episode of Risking Enchantment. I'm your host, Rachel Sherlock, and joining me this week is Phoebe Watson.
Hi guys!
We're back, I'm back in Ireland, Phoebe didn't leave, and we're cozied up in my room, which still has a few Christmas lights draped around it, and we've got cups of tea.
It's biscuit brew.
It's not just tea, it's biscuit brew. So this is a leftover of my trip to Cumbria, which is a lovely box of Yorkshire tea biscuit brew, which is just a type of regular black tea that has the taste of biscuits in it, and it is just as delightful as that sounds.
And you can't get it anywhere but the north of England.
Which is why I have to keep going back there.
Naturally.
Not just to see my friends. It's all about the biscuit brew.
Of course.
But this is all working in our favour today because it's a very cosy setting for quite a cosy topic, I think. The topic for today that we're going to talk about is what I'm terming the Sanctity of Smallness, which is we're going to take a look at some books and some examples of literature which I think really celebrate a small and a simple life.
Yeah, when you mentioned this topic to me, I just laughed for a good 2 minutes. Not because it's a funny topic, but because it's so you.
I know. It's very me. If you could see my room right now, you'd see all kinds of cards and illustrations of lovely, cute, small things. But for this particular podcast we're going to talk about, I know you all know that I'm an enormous Tolkien fan, so of course we're going to talk about the Shire and the Hobbits. No, we're not going to talk about them.
Yet.
But in terms of a little funny run-up to this, I was once talking with a friend of mine. Her name's Zoe, and I think she's listening, so hi Zoe. And I met Zoe through the fact that we're both enormous Tolkien fans. And despite that, we both agreed that the one fictional world that we would like to live in the most is actually the world of Brambly Hedge. And if you've been listening since the start, you might actually recognise the name Brambly Hedge. If you're very cool, you might have actually known Brambly Hedge before this podcast, but most people haven't heard of it. And I like to think that I'm setting myself a little bit of a challenge. So in the first podcast, we talked about 3 books or pieces of art that really define us and represent our personalities. And I picked Tolkien, Flannery O'Connor, and Brambly Hedge. And despite the fact that the first 2 are actually Catholic authors, the first one we're going to do a Catholic podcast on is Brambly Hedge.
As it should be.
So for anyone who doesn't know what is Brambly Hedge, Brambly Hedge is a series of children's stories. They're also a delightful stop-motion animation series about the lives and the ups and downs of a little community of mice who live in a small community called Brambly Hedge. If you're trying to picture it in your mind, the illustration style is very similar to Beatrix Potter, except that it's actually, I would consider it a lot richer. It's got a lot more detail. The author, Jill Barklem, who's also the illustrator, goes through really detailed maps of the community, of the different trees where the different family lives, and in each of them you can see their houses and how they're all different, and there's strings of crab apples and there's pots of jam, and it's all very detailed and very beautiful. And one of the things that always strikes me is the level of detail around the crafts. Like, she always draws these beautiful quilts and these like handmade toys, and it's really, really beautiful. And in terms of, like, again, drawing from the reference point of Beatrix Potter, I find the stories pretty different. I never actually got on that well with Beatrix Potter when I was a child. Anyone who rereads them as an adult usually finds that they're pretty dark. They're usually stories about people who do something wrong and the bad things that happen to them when they do something wrong.
Lovely. I haven't reread these since I was like 5.
Yeah,
so.
Well, like Squirrel Nutkin loses his tail, and Peter Rabbit gets sick from running away, and like all of those things. So whereas Brambly Hedge is a lot, people do get into scrapes or get into sticky situations, but it's a lot less didactic and a lot less moralistic. It's more just about looking at this community and kind of falling in love with it and falling in love with their way of life. And I adore it. I've got Brambly Hedge teacups, I've got Brambly Hedge postcards, and I've got a lovely compendium of Brambly Hedge stories from none other than Phoebe sitting next to me. But the most important thing that I think is so enchanting about Brambly Hedge is their way of life, and in each of the stories, it's usually centered around a particular community celebration, whether they're dragging an enormous Yule log into the fire for them to burn for the winter, or building an ice palace, or they have a wedding in one of them. There's this real sense of home life and of tight-knit community life, and this closeness. Obviously they're mice, so closeness to the earth and the work that they do with their hands, and it's just a really uplifting example of like simple living, and it's a real, like, it really cherishes that simple living. And if you're wondering what that might have to do with faith, I think it's because I love how Jesus and our Catholic faith calls us to really cherish our daily lives and cherish the moments and offer up those moments and love them. So of course there's an element of our faith that has us going out and doing big things and bold moves and going to the other side of the world to serve people in a completely different culture than your own, and that's all a really beautiful part of our faith. But even in the middle of that, you can still cherish the little moments. And also for most of us, most of our lives are fairly routine and mundane and in a way small, and it's just a wonderful thing to take the time and love where you're at and really foster a sense of love and community and I'm going to say liturgy, but I mean more of a sense of seasons and moments of celebration and marking moments as they go past. So that's what we want to talk today. That's what I'm terming the sanctity of smallness. And I think when you talk about something like that, you kind of can't get away from Thérèse of Lisieux.
I mean, the little flower.
She's kind of the embodiment of that idea of the beautiful in the little.
Yeah, wasn't it? I only know this quote from Bishop Barron talking about it.
Yeah.
He talks about her describing great saints marching ahead and her as a little child lifting her arms up to God and then going, but then I get further than any of you.
I love that image, yeah, that she really celebrates in being the little small one.
Yeah.
It's really great.
Does that mean I get to quote her?
Yes, go ahead.
So, one of my favourite images of Thérèse is that she's talking about how she's offering up the small little pains of her daily life and turning them into flowers for the Lord, which I think is a pretty common illustration, but it's really beautiful. And one of the passages I read recently when I was looking for the main quote, but what I found instead was a description of her being blamed for breaking a vase or for having put it in somewhere stupid where it got broken, and her just taking that and resisting the temptation to say, oh no, it wasn't me.
Yeah, to push back,
to
just accept it.
To just accept that and then making that a little offering. And for me that actually really explained the theology of offer it up.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it.
And then even little things of like smiling at a sister that she finds really difficult to get on with, and by that expression of love, coming to love that sister better. Yeah, and obviously she's so famous for the little way, isn't it? Yeah, it's the little way. It's her idea of how ordinary people can become saints. And in terms of simplicity, one of the quotes from her book, she's talking about spiritual direction and finding it hard. And one of the older mothers in the community says to her, I don't suppose that you ever have very much to tell to your superiors. What makes you think that, mother? Because you have an extremely simple soul. However, it will be even more simple when you become perfect. The closer we come to God, the more simple we become.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. And it also, I've got another saint quote picked out, which is from St. Vincent de Paul, which says, simplicity ought to be held in great esteem. It is a virtue most worthy of love, because it leads us straight to the kingdom of heaven. Which is why I think it's such a nice thing to have these books, especially for children, to grow up with this love of the simple and this love of the people around you, and the most immediate way of loving, not loving, the way I think it's a G.K. Chesterton quote where he's talking about how we're called to love our neighbours as well as our enemies, probably because the two are the same. That it's not about loving humanity, that God never asks us to love humanity, he asks us to love our neighbour, this really like personal connection. And obviously I know for a lot of children's literature, the idea of like a homestead or a small community is fairly recurrent because obviously that's what children know. But I think it's telling that there's a sense of nostalgia around these things when we grow up, that we understand the world as children as a very, in a way, simple thing. And then we grow up and it gets a lot more complicated and we have different ambitions and we want to go off and do other things. And, we have to manage all of these expectations of ourselves and of other people. And that there is this kind of deep desire and deep yearning to achieve that simplicity and that simplicity of living. And I just think, in a way, that reading these stories of small little moments between mice in a hedgerow, that they remind us that there is a simplicity that is good and that we can aim at in our lives, that God is, in a way, calling us to these simple communities.
I think they really teach us in a very gentle way how to bring that love of simplicity or love of humanity in the neighbour into our own lives as well.
Absolutely. And I think both me and Phoebe have, I think, the same favourite quote from the Screwtape letters, which Phoebe's going to read out now, which also kind of shows how having these simple pleasures and these simple loves can really bring us actually closer to God.
Yeah, and as with C.S. Lewis, it couldn't possibly be a 2-line quote.
No, it has to be a giant chunk, so I'm sorry about this, but we cut it down as much as we could, but we just love this section so much. So just to obviously set it up in case anyone doesn't know what the Screwtape letters is, it's about two devils who are writing to each other and one is informing them how to pull a particular person away from God.
Yeah, the devil Screwtape is writing to this younger devil who is specifically assigned to tempt this particular person away. Now for your blunders. On your own showing, you first of all allowed the patient to read a book that he really enjoyed, because he enjoyed it, and not in order to make clever remarks about it to his new friends. In the second place, you allowed him to walk down to the old mill and have tea there, a walk through the country that he really likes, and taken alone. In other words, you allowed him 2 real, positive pleasures. Were you so ignorant so as not to see the danger of this? The characteristics of pain and pleasures is that they are unmistakably real, and therefore, as far as they go, give the man who feels them a touchstone of reality. You were trying to damn your patient by the world, that is, by palming off vanity, bustle, irony, and expensive tedium as pleasures. How can you have failed to see that a real pleasure was the last thing you ought to have let him meet? Didn't you foresee that it would just kill by contrast all the trumpery which you had been so laboriously trying to teach him to value? And that sort of pleasure which the book and the walk gave him was the most dangerous of all. That it would peel off from his sensibility the kind of crust which you have been forming on it, and make him feel that he was really coming home, recovering himself. As a preliminary to detaching himself from the enemy, you wanted to detach him from himself, and had made some progress in doing so. Now all that is undone. The deepest likings and impulses of any man are the raw material, the starting point, which the enemy has furnished him. To get him away from those, it is therefore always a point gained. Even in things indifferent, it is always desirable to substitute the standards of the world, or convention, or fashion, for a human's own real likings and dislikings. I myself would carry this very far. I would make it a rule to eradicate from my patient any strong personal taste which is not actually a sin, even if it is something quite trivial, such as a fondness for country cricket, or collecting stamps, or drinking cocoa. Such things, I grant you, have nothing of virtue in them, but there is a sort of innocence and humility and self-forgetfulness about them which I distrust. The man who truly and disinterestedly enjoys any one thing in the world, for its own sake, and without caring twopence what other people say about it, is by very fact forearmed against some of our subtlest modes of attack. You should always try to make the patient abandon the people, or food, or books he really likes, in favour of the best people, the right food, the important books. I have known a human defended from strong temptations to social ambition by a still stronger taste for tripe and onions.
Well done. I know that was a really long thing to read out, but both of us are just so in love with that whole section. It's so exciting to hear about how even something that isn't moral, like he says, like drinking cocoa or collecting stamps, those aren't things that you're going to take with you to heaven, or they're not going to be counted up in your number of virtues. But the fact that you really like them is, in a way, it comes from God, because there's no reason to like them other than the fact that you like them. It's not coming from someone else, it's just coming from within you, and obviously that's fostered by God.
Yeah, that reminds me actually of something Father Pieper was saying at our retreat, mm-hmm. of how we, in all our idiosyncrasies and foibles, mm-hmm. bring that to what we do for God.
Yeah.
And he rejoices in those, and those are part of the mission that he's built in for us.
Yeah. And that isn't there another quote which is that you have to be the saint that you are and not someone else?
Yeah.
Which it goes into all of these little things. And what we're not saying is that you can't have big ambitions or that you shouldn't want to do big things for Christ, but that rather that you're missing something if you're so caught up in a heady world of ideas or what the world thinks or even your own plans, that you miss the present moment and the present people in front of you to love and the present community that you have to serve.
Or that you think that you're not doing something for God if you're not doing something big.
Yeah.
I mean, there should never be an excuse not to do something big.
Yeah.
But I think also when you do the small well,
mm-hmm.
it grows into the big.
Like for me, I think when I think of religious vocations, and I'm particularly thinking of religious sisters and monks as well, that in some ways it's such a big vocation, and they leave everything and they have to sacrifice so much to go and live this life. But the life that they're living is a life of perfecting the simple routine.
Very true. That's
and
the more extreme of them and the more simple of them.
Yeah, and that kind of casting off of the noise, which is, there's so much noise in the world today that it's so easy to spend your whole life listening to someone's opinion on politics or someone's opinion on this. And I mean, one of the kind of really obvious things that we could be talking about right now is the need for a smallness in terms of economics. Like when we talk about communities and when we talk about real living, there's a sense that maybe that's not the same as a big rat race or a push for progress, and
or environmental simplicity, or
that there is definitely a really powerful connection between the way that we live and the way that we exist in terms of a world of commerce or systems of governance and things like that. And those are all really, really important things. I don't think we're going to go into them that closely here, just because there are people who could talk about it far better than us. This is not something that we would necessarily have the most expert opinions on. But a few things that I am going to mention, which I think are really great kind of resources, was there's a book called Small is Beautiful, with the subtitle Economics as If People Mattered. Which is, it's a really famous book actually, and it was written by E.F. Schumacher, who was actually a convert to Catholicism, and he converted about 2 years before he wrote it, and continued to be a really well-regarded and well-acclaimed economist. And I've read parts of it, and it's actually really accessible, and it's a really, really lovely and intelligent way of looking at economics and looking at other ways of making societies work and fostering good communities and fostering good business and good progress. But it's really, really nice, and I'd really recommend it. The other one I'd say is, I know Josef Pieper has written quite a lot on leisure and the basis of culture and things like that. And then, of course, there's always the last 3 popes, or pretty much the last, I'm sure you could name even more popes than this, but John Paul II, Benedict XVI and Francis have all spoken at length. I particularly love some of Benedict's things about the need to stay away from the graspingness and the clutchingness of constantly attaining more material wealth and trying to focus solely on the consumerism and how that's so damaging, not only to others, not only to the environment, but also to ourselves and to our soul. That there's some really beautiful things in there that are so well informed and so interesting, and definitely something that everyone should check out. But for this podcast, I think we're going to focus more on how it affects your soul, just yourself, and not focusing on the way it affects the wider world.
And then talk about books.
Yes, I'm circling back around to books just now, but before we do anything, I need to quote C.S. Lewis again.
Naturally.
So this is from The Weight of Glory, and it really kind of sums up what I was saying. He says, "As long as we are thinking of natural values, we must say that the sun looks down on nothing half so good as a household laughing together over a meal, or 2 friends talking over a pint of beer, or a man alone reading a book that interests him, and that all economies, politics, laws, armies, and institutions, save insofar as they prolong and multiply such scenes, are a mere ploughing the sand and sowing the ocean, a meaningless vanity and vexation of the spirit. Collective activities are, of course, necessary, but this is the end to which they are necessary."
I love it.
It's great. I mean, we should just have a podcast where C.S. Lewis tells us all how to live our lives.
Naturally. From the Oxford Dawn.
Yes, exactly. So now that we've set up why it's important to foster a love of these kinds of stories, we're going to give some more examples of them. So Phoebe, do you want to go first? What, other than the very acclaimed and weighty tome of Brambly Hedge, what would you recommend for fostering a love of the simple life?
Well, I believe I also spoke about this in our very first episode.
Mm-hmm.
But I was thinking about Anne of Green Gables.
Yes, naturally.
Of course. And again, it's very local, parish-based, and it's watching a girl grow.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the beauty of it is watching the simple mistakes that she makes and the joy that she finds, and even being able to incorporate that into growing to be better people ourselves.
Yeah, I love it. And I love how much, again, there's usually a fairly common theme with a lot of these stories, which is a closeness to nature, because I love the descriptions of nature in Anne of Green Gables. I think that's fitting, because I think most people feel like when they get stressed out and when they get caught up in the world, the thing that they want to do is get back to nature. And in a way that's, obviously God works through us to build incredible things, but creation is what he specifically created as well.
Yeah, it's also how that beautiful creation setting that she's set in with the beauty, but more importantly, the love that she's given and the support that she's given allow her to flourish and grow. And it's also beautiful, you actually start off with her as a 13-year-old, I think.
Yeah.
She feels much younger.
Yeah.
Like, it feels like you could be taking her from the age of 8, but that's a nice age as well, in terms of that there's an innocence but also a maturity and a sorrow about the isolation of her childhood.
And I think for me, one of the things that really shows that is actually through the way that she interacts with nature, because typically when she first arrives and whenever she sort of gets too caught up in her own imaginings and her own versions of the world, she imagines the world around her to be sort of away from where she's actually at. Like, it's when she arrives as an orphan, it's kind of like she wants to live in this imaginary world that isn't real, whereas when she's most at home and most settled, she's kind of more just loving what's actually there. And of course it is actually a beautiful setting, and that's one of the things that she really loves, is that she actually gets to live somewhere beautiful, whereas where she lived before was very sad and drab and horrible, but whereas this is actually beautiful. But I love that sense of her actually being present to the actual surroundings in a way, and definitely enhancing them with her own imagination, but it's still an actual cherishing of the trees that are really there and not just the ones that are in her imagination.
I think I'm going to have to read a quote.
Another one?
Another one. Well, even, I just love the first 2 sentences of this chapter. Anne was bringing the cows home from the back pasture by way of Lover's Lane. It was a September evening, and all the gaps and clearings in the wood were brimmed up with a ruby sunset light.
Beautiful.
And I love the mixture of the Lover's Lane and bringing the cows home.
Yeah, there's that mundaneness coupled with the beauty. And I think that's also important, because I think it's important to say that we're not saying, if you live a nice simple life, nothing bad will ever happen and you won't have any troubles or trials. That's not at all what we're saying. And I mean, that's exactly what we were saying with Saint Therese, which is that we have to offer up the small sufferings, and that we can often characterize our lives by the moments when we have big sufferings, but that even the small sufferings in our life are worth bringing to God and are worth being transformed by Him into something beautiful, so that, you know, the boringness of bringing the cows home can be transfigured into the beauty of Lover's Lane.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. In terms of tone, the one that I'm going to do next is a little bit similar. The storyline is kind of similar, which is Goodnight, Mr. Tom.
Aww.
Which is one of my all-time favourite books. It might actually be the book I've reread the most times. I adore that book. So it's the story of young Will, who is taken out of London during the Blitz and sent to live in the countryside in Little Weirwold, which is a very romantic name for a town. And he goes to live with a sort of gruff old man, and Willie is quite like a small sickly boy, and he's been quite abused by his mother, and he comes very afraid and very unwell and very unsure of himself. And Mr. Tom is this kind of gruff figure who doesn't want to talk to anyone, and the two of them soften each other's edges and open each other up for love. But the setting, even in gruff Mr. Tom's house, is so beautiful and cozy, and he's got Sam the dog, and he lives in a little house next to the graveyard, and I always remember there's that really vivid image when he shows up of Mr. Tom making him a bacon sandwich, and it's just so visceral, the fat seeping into the white fluffy bread. And there's a lot to do with painting and just the bright colours, and there's this real beautiful simplicity to that life, and that it's full of colour and it's full of those small joys, and the community of people rallying around this little boy.
Yeah, I was going to say that, the friends he makes, and the different, is it the doctor who sends the jumpers for him?
Yes, and then they go blackberry picking, and they has to wear all of the clothes cobbled together from people around the town or the little village. And it's really, really sweet, and it works because it would be saccharine if it weren't for the fact that both Willie, who obviously is coming from a very difficult background, but also the fact that they're in the middle of a war, and there are people who should be part of the community that are in this battle and who might be dying. And I've never cried so hard at anything than I have reading Goodnight, Mr. Tom, which I was reading when I was not supposed to be reading it. I read it right before my English exam, where I was answering questions on a different book, so my mum was furious that I'd started reading a book that wasn't on my exam papers. So I remember locking the bathroom door so that I could keep reading it, and then I got to the bit where there's quite a climactic bit at the end, which is very sad, and I was just crying, and Mum called for dinner, and I was like, what am I gonna do? But I adore that book. It's so good. But it works because you are in love with both the main characters, but also their setting and the people that they're around, and you want this for them, and you want them to be opened up to love it more than they do, because both of them are quite emotionally closed off. So yeah, that's my second one, Goodnight, Mr. Tom.
I think my second was following on from Anne of Green Gables, the next book that came to mind with Little Women.
Yeah, they're kind of an ilk, aren't they?
And with that is a more uncommon one. I'm not sure if you've read it. It's called What Katy Did.
No. It's
by a lady called Susan Coolidge. What Katy Did is about this rather wild 12-year-old girl with 6 siblings, and their mothers died, so their aunt's looking after them. It's like she's looking after the house.
Yeah.
The father is a doctor.
Yeah.
And they don't get on very well with the aunt. But then Katy hurts her back off a swing.
Yeah.
And she has to lie flat in bed for 2 years or something like that.
Wow.
They don't even know if she's ever going to be able to walk again. And it's kind of about her learning through that. And there's an older cousin in that who is crippled for life, who visits them carried on her sofa.
Yeah.
And how she brings like a beauty and a joy to the family, even despite the fact she's on a sofa, she's still the centre point around which the house turns. And she speaks to Katy and says, well, you can lie there becoming miserable and everyone will avoid you because they don't want to be in this room.
Yeah.
Or you can make the room pretty. You can open up the blinds even if it hurts your eyes, brush your hair, and welcome everyone here. And they will come here and centre their lives around you.
That's beautiful.
And yeah, it's just kind of her trials, and then after a while the aunt dies, and she's then trying to do like the management of the house, like the logistics of what are we going to have for dinner, and like her trials in that, and her trials in kind of trying to manage the younger ones a bit, and it's lovely.
That's so nice. I've only read Anne of Green Gables. I have seen a version of Little Women, but in my mind, even though I haven't read them, they're all like in the same bracket. But that's really, really nice.
Yeah, I think what Little Women is, even what you were saying about the war, and like Little Women is similar in that it's set in the American Civil War.
Yeah.
So the fathers are fighting and the mother's left with 4 daughters to look after, and it's Marmie's kind of efforts to teach her children to be better, and them kind of drawing out the friends next door, which is really beautiful as well.
That's really nice. My next one is not actually a book, it's an essay by Hilaire Belloc. And I know we're kind of just out of the Christmas season, but I'm afraid I'm a little slow on my Christmas reading this year, so I didn't get around to it until at the very end, which was reading an essay called A Remaining Christmas. It's just an essay where he goes through the traditions of his own family in celebrating Christmas, and how people are, even in his own time, saying that, oh, the old ways are gone and there's no such thing as a real Christmas anymore, and nobody knows how to celebrate it properly, and everything that we had kind of built up before this has been scattered. And so he's saying that this is a remaining Christmas. This is the remains of a real tradition and a real love of festivity and at that sense of interwovenness with everything. So it's largely a description of his own house, and then the kind of ins and outs of what happens at Christmas time. But it's just so enchanting, and he's so aware of the fact that he's trying to make something enchanting. So I love it for that as well. But just to read like a little line from it. He's saying about the kids playing there at Christmas, and he says, "These songs are game songs and are sung to keep time with the various parts in each game, and the men and things and animals which you hear mentioned in these songs are all of that countryside. Indeed, the tradition of Christmas here is what it should be everywhere, knit into the very stuff of the place. So that I fancy the little children, when they think of Bethlehem, see it in their minds as though it were in the winter depth of England, which is as it should be." Which I just love that, like, in a way about making it personal to you, because not everyone's idea of a simple and a good life is going to be the same. And I'm going to touch again on that. There's another quote that I wanted to add, which was, "This which I have just described is not in a novel or in a play. It is real and goes on as the ordinary habit of living men and women. I fear that set down thus in our terribly changing time, it must sound very strange and, perhaps in places, grotesque. But to those who practice it, it is not only sacred, but normal, having in the whole of the complicated affair a sacramental quality and an effect of benediction not to be despised." Which is kind of at the core of what we're saying, that these small routines and these small sacrifices that we make can be a form of benediction, that there's like a holiness to them, even in their meagerness and in their humbleness. And again, I know we've just come out of Christmas, but that is kind of the idea of Christmas, that the humbling, that Christ would come as something so small and so humble that it's almost unthinkable, you know? And so in doing so, sanctifies all of the small things of our lives.
I heard a great quote about Christ becoming man and related to the Eucharist, which was, well, if God can become a man, can't he also become a piece of bread?
Yeah, that's...
Which, to me, really helped to also slot into place the unimaginable jump of God to man.
Yeah. That is, because in some ways we find it, because we read about like being made in God's image, we think that God to man bit is really simple and straightforward and even obvious, when it's not at all. That's so cool. I really, really love that. But just to return to one of the points I was making about how it's not going to look the same to everyone, there's one thing that I did want to bring up, which is that obviously the examples that we've given here are largely English, British,
well, mine are American.
I was just going to say American, Canadian, but there's a kind of, I guess you would call it Western. But there's a huge range of things that can evoke this for all kinds of people. And if you feel it, like, I just think that we can look so far and see so many things. Like, for me, one of the best examples of it is in a lot of the Studio Ghibli films.
I was just thinking that. Though, to be honest, the best example that came immediately to mind was Howl's Moving Castle.
That's what I was thinking.
Is based on a novel by an English woman.
Well, maybe we're cutting corners then. But I also, amazingly, I feel it in Spirited Away.
Absolutely.
Which you kind of shouldn't, because she's sort of living in a nightmare world. But again, there's that, like, that pulling together, and that I always love those scenes where she's like absolutely munching down on some rice, and it's a very human moment. And I love, love, love those films.
Have you ever seen Kiki's Delivery Service?
No, I haven't yet.
One of the lovely things about it is how homely it makes her magic.
Yeah.
Like, she's flying around on a broomstick.
Yeah.
But she's running this little delivery service.
Yeah.
And it's really cute. I can't remember that much of it. That kind of medley of the magical and the normal, the mundane. And
the other example I have is I particularly love the illustrations of a Swedish artist. His name was Carl Larsson, and he was part of the arts and craft movement, but he really embodies that beautiful colours and like the joy and the exuberance of home life. So I really enjoy those as well. But I would also love, like, if anyone listening has examples of any kind, but particularly from all over the world, I would love to find out more and to have a kind of bigger scope for this. So I really love finding the new versions of like a homeliness that I hadn't thought of before.
I actually just thought of one. It's a book called Journey to the River Sea.
Okay.
It's about a girl who travels out from an English boarding school to the Amazon to live with her cousins.
Yeah.
And I mean, her cousins are really mean, and it's kind of a counterbalance of like a harsh home environment with a beautiful Amazon setting, and then like a beautiful community that's backing her up.
Yeah.
In spite of the cousins.
Yeah. You see, that's beautiful. So I think, do you have any other examples that you wanted to?
Well, I was thinking of, I think I might have mentioned this in another podcast, but The Wise Woman by George MacDonald.
Yeah.
It's the one straight after The Shadow.
Okay.
Story. But it's about this witch woman, kind of, who's called in to help the king and queen with their unruly princess daughter. And there's another unruly child who's a shepherdess, like a shepherd and a shepherdess's child. And there's kind of like a real hominess to both of their scenes, and they end up kind of being switched in place to a certain extent. And the wise woman is trying to cure the princess of her temper tantrums.
Yeah.
By very simple means of like, well, in this room, like she's locked in the house, or partly she's afraid to go outside because there are wolves outside. And she's told, if you do your chores and clean the place, you get fed.
Yeah.
Or for the first day she gets fed regardless. And then the next day she doesn't get fed because she hasn't done her chores. And even that kind of like simplicity of a good education.
Yeah, and of learning how to be in that kind of space.
Yeah. Though I think the best thing about that was it had gone on for quite a while, this kind of education about it. And then she was like, and now you're only at the beginning. Which for me was great because often those can kind of seem like a quick fix.
Yeah.
And it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was like, and now we're going to send you here for 2 years. Because you still haven't learnt this properly.
Okay, that's really cool. That's I said it last time. I still haven't read it, but I will get to read George MacDonald very soon. I'm looking forward to it. Well, okay, so I think that's pretty much everything we want to say on the sanctity of smallness.
I think we didn't talk about the dangers of it.
Oh yeah, did you want to bring that up a little bit?
Well, I was kind of thinking, actually this is where the Shire ties in.
Yeah.
Of Bilbo having to be driven out of the Shire for his adventure.
Yeah.
And I think that is the counterbalancing danger.
Yeah.
Of in where it's orientated towards God.
Yeah.
It's good, and like anything, when it's orientated towards ourselves,
and our own comforts and our own lack of willingness to engage with the world or go out and do the thing that's being asked of us and do the right thing.
Yeah. If it becomes I don't want to leave my bubble.
Yeah.
I don't want to leave my cozy space.
Yeah.
Then there's a problem.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point because, like I said at the start, in some ways the Hobbits are sort of the ultimate version of this, but they do take it to that extreme. They're too complacent. They're too self-involved. And I think because I was thinking of this, and I was thinking of when we're talking about even like the worldliness and the economic side, that for me anyway, the thing that I see a lot is that there's so many people, including myself, that are so caught up in the lives of famous people who are famous for no reason, and they live in a different continent to me, and like I don't know why I need to know about them and why that should detract me from what I'm doing right here and now. And that there is a balance because we are called to be in the world but not of the world, isn't that it?
Yeah. And then I would argue that there are times when your knowledge of such things leads to better community.
Yeah.
Because that's what we chat about.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it is about striking that balance. I'm not telling everyone that they need to go live in the hedgerows and
become mice.
And give up their phone or give up.
I mean, I think the main reason, coming back to how you started, why this was your ideal world to live in, is because there are no dangerous adventures. Yeah.
That's true. They're very small and self-contained, and they're very straightforward in some ways. They get, at one point, the mice get lost for a whole night. But yeah, it's true. It's quite a small world, but there is definitely a danger in keeping your world too small, and it is a balance that you have to strike your whole life. And I think that's kind of the exciting thing. The point that I would make is that I was thinking of, I know, we've quoted C.S. Lewis so much already, I know. But
well, at least I only quoted him once, which is what my rule was.
But that, to me, one of the most magical bits in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, so she's come to a magical land, it's covered in snow and everything's very exotic, but the magical bits aren't the bits where you meet the White Witch or even the bits in her castle. It's when she's having tea and toast in Mr. Tumnus's house, or when they're all with the beavers and they're having dinner together. So it's almost like she goes out on this adventure, or they go out on this adventure, and while they're out there they have these moments where they can really cherish and love the simple things.
I think that's a really good way of balancing it. Yeah. That the balance of the big and the small together allow you to cherish the small.
Yeah. That she had to, because in some ways, even though like you would think at the start of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, they're in this big house, and that's quite like nicely described, but I don't ever think of like, oh, I'd love to go to the big house in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Of course, you want to go to Narnia, but
priorities, people.
I mean, I will say, as I've said before, I do like the house at the start of The Magician's Nephew, but that does seem a little bit more magical to me. But the romance of having tea and toast in a little dry cave, comes from the fact that she's in a whole new world with a whole new person, and it's exciting, and she's put herself out there in a way to experience this. So I think that's maybe a nice way of like striking a balance between the two.
Very much agreed.
Alrighty then. I don't know if you remember this, Phoebe, but that leaves us with one last question, which is, what are you enjoying at the moment?
Well, I'm still reading The Once a Future King.
After all this time.
Much to your annoyance. So I was actually thinking of what we watched last week, which was the Restoring British Landmarks programme.
Oh, interesting. I'm going to have a similar answer, actually. So,
oops. And even I think it fits in in terms of cozy as well, because it's just this documentary series about a charity trust restoring old buildings.
Yeah.
And going into them and figuring out how they can keep them and trying to rebuild parts of them. And it's just really cute and nice, and the music's great.
Yeah, it's a really great series. It should be, if you're in the UK or Ireland, it's I believe it's on the All 4 website. I don't know if that's in America, but if you go to Channel 4, they have a lot of their programs online so that you can just watch them.
It's about 1.5 years or 2 years old.
Yeah, they have they have
No, I'm just saying that to clarify if anyone's looking for it as a recent thing. No. We taped this and are only now finishing it.
Yeah, we don't get around to watching a lot of TV, which is a shame, because we've nice things taped. But on a similar note, I've been trying to for the thing that I'm enjoying at the moment, I'm trying to uplift my social media a little bit and have nicer things in it. So I've been watching a lot of art restoration videos, and there's one channel in particular called Baumgartner Restoration, where he just takes paintings and restores them, and like he narrates what he's doing and like how the different elements works and how he strips the varnish. But it's really very fascinating for me to see these paintings sort of re-emerge out of the dirt of ages and to be lovingly brought back into a space where they can be really enjoyed and really loved. So I'm really enjoying that. So that's just on YouTube. But the other update, as I'm sure you were all waiting with bated breath, I have in fact finished The Count of Monte Cristo. And I can give it my full stamp of approval. It was excellent. I really, really enjoyed it. I would recommend all 52 hours of it. It was great from start to finish. So that's another achievement unlocked. It's a good start of the year. It makes me feel really happy because it means I get to write in my diary that I've read like a 1,000-page book at the start of my year, even though I've been listening to it for about 3 months at this point. So that's a little ego boost for me. So with that, I think we've just one last thing we want to say before we leave, other than to say, if you're enjoying the podcast, we'd really love it if you could leave a rating or even write a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening. It really helps us reach more people. So if you could do that, we'd really appreciate it. So I think we're going to say goodbye.
Bye.
This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.